You thought you knew what groceries cost. You can see the sticker price on every item. But there's a layer beneath the numbers, a system quietly breaking down in ways that most people never connect. Every time you walk down an aisle that feels a little emptier, every time you notice a product that shrank without warning, every time your cart feels lighter but the receipt feels heavier, you're witnessing something deeper than simple inflation. This isn't just about the price tags changing. It's about a fundamental shift in how food moves through America, how it arrives in your town, how it reaches your table. The real cost of groceries isn't what you pay at checkout. It's what you can't see in the supply chains stretching thin, in the distributors adding fees no one mentions, in the workers losing hours while prices climb, in the communities watching their last store close, in the families reorganizing their entire lives around what they can no longer afford. The numbers everyone talks about tell one story, but beneath them runs a current that's changing what it means to feed a family in this country. Most people sense it. Hardly anyone sees the whole picture. The real price of groceries in America isn't on any receipt, and it's getting higher every day. There was a time when grocery shopping meant one thing: predictable. You knew what your staples would cost within a few dollars. You could walk into any store with a general idea of what a week's worth of food required, and the number rarely shocked you. Families built their routines around that stability. Workers planned their hours knowing what groceries demanded from their paycheck. But somewhere in the last few years, that predictability vanished. What changed wasn't subtle. Food prices surged 30% since early 2020, according to federal inflation data. That's not a gradual climb. That's a break from everything families knew. In December alone, food jumped nearly 1% in a single month, the sharpest spike in over a year. But those numbers hide something more unsettling. They measure averages. They don't capture the products that doubled. Orange juice up nearly 40% year over year. Ground beef climbing double digits. Coffee hitting 15% increases in some categories. These aren't luxury items. These are the foundations of American kitchens. And they're becoming unaffordable at a speed that official statistics can't quite communicate. The pressure comes from multiple directions at once. Transportation costs that distributors are passing directly to stores. Labor shortages that force companies to raise wages but also cut hours. Supply chain disruptions that never fully healed from pandemic shocks. Tariffs on imports like coffee and bananas that add invisible taxes most shoppers never hear about. And beneath all of it, something quieter but more permanent: shrinkflation, the practice of making packages smaller while keeping prices the same or higher. One analysis found that 1/3 of common grocery products have shrunk since the pandemic. Same shelf space, same packaging design, but inside, there's less. A few fewer sheets on the paper towel roll, a smaller bag of chips, a shampoo bottle holding 3 fewer ounces. You're paying the same price for measurably less product. And unless you're tracking ounces per dollar on every item, you'll never notice until it's too late. A mother in suburban Ohio told researchers she used to buy the same brands her own mother bought. Now she can't. She switched to store brands, then started skipping items entirely. Her grocery list has 20 fewer things than it did 3 years ago, but her spending is exactly the same. She's buying less and paying more. That's the hidden math reshaping American families. But the sticker price is only the beginning. What hardly anyone mentions is the web of fees buried in the system long before food reaches the shelf. Distributors have flooded the supply chain with obscure charges that food manufacturers publicly complain about but can't avoid. Fuel surcharges, handling fees, accessorial charges for liftgate service, inside delivery, after-hours pickup. Some companies report seeing bills with line items they don't recognize, fees that weren't there 6 months ago, costs they have no power to negotiate. One food executive described it as a flood of mysterious expenses, each small enough to seem unremarkable, together large enough to reshape the entire cost structure of getting products to stores. Industry estimates suggest distribution and transportation represent 6 to 8% of overall food costs, and that percentage is climbing. When diesel prices surge, when driver shortages force overtime pay, when warehouses add storage fees because products are sitting longer due to demand fluctuations, all of those costs move downstream. The grocery store absorbs some, but most of it lands on you, and you never see a breakdown. There's no line on your receipt that says fuel surcharge passed from distributor. It just appears as a higher price on the olive oil or the cereal or the frozen vegetables. The supply chain has become a hidden tax system, and every link in the chain is adding charges. What's particularly insidious is how these costs stack. A product might face a transportation fee increase of 3%, a warehousing cost bump of 2%, and a handling charge addition of 1%. Individually, they seem minor. Together, they compound into double-digit price increases that feel disconnected from the actual cost of producing the food. A farmer growing tomatoes hasn't raised prices, but by the time those tomatoes travel through 3 distribution points, get stored in 2 warehouses, and move on 4 trucks, the cost has ballooned. And no one entity is responsible. It's a system failure that looks like individual business decisions. A manager at a mid-sized grocery chain in Pennsylvania explained it this way. They receive invoices from distributors with fees labeled in ways that make it impossible to challenge. Logistics adjustment, supply chain variability cost, seasonal demand modifier. Each sounds reasonable in isolation. But when every distributor is adding 3 to 5 similar fees, the cumulative impact is crushing. And the grocery store can't absorb it all without going out of business. So the price of that can of tomatoes goes up. And you never know why. Then there are the workers who used to rely on grocery jobs as stable income. Those jobs are changing in ways that don't make headlines, but devastate individual lives. A report analyzing major grocery chains found that companies have been systematically cutting worker hours since 2019 while simultaneously dealing with wage pressures. It's a brutal squeeze. Minimum wages increased in dozens of states entering 2026, with more than 8 million workers seeing pay bumps. That sounds like progress. But for many grocery employees, it came with a catch. Hours got slashed. A worker in Southern California who used to get 35 hours a week now gets 22. Her hourly wage went up by $1. Her weekly paycheck went down by $80. She's earning more per hour, but taking home significantly less overall. And she lost access to health benefits that required 30 hours minimum. This pattern is repeating across the country. Grocery stores, facing rising labor costs they can't fully pass to consumers without losing business to competitors, are cutting the total number of hours they schedule. Fewer workers on the floor, longer lines at checkout, shelves that stay unstocked longer. Customers notice the service declining. What they don't see is the worker who used to be there 4 days a week now getting called in for 2. The economic mechanism is straightforward but cruel. When wages rise without corresponding productivity increases or the ability to raise prices proportionally, companies reduce labor hours to maintain profitability. It's rational from a business perspective. From a human perspective, it's devastating. A single mother working grocery in a rural Tennessee town described trying to patch together shifts from 3 different part-time jobs because none will give her full-time hours. She spends more on gas driving between jobs than she gains from the higher minimum wage. Her kids see her less. Her stress has compounded, and she's one of thousands in the same situation. The grocery store itself is struggling with thin margins, unable to pay more without raising prices that would drive customers away. Everyone in the system is trapped. Meanwhile, the executive pay gap has become almost surreal. Analysis of major grocery chains shows CEOs earning the average American worker's annual salary in less than 20 hours of their own time. That disparity fuels resentment, but it doesn't change the fundamental economic pressure. Even if executive pay were redistributed entirely to workers, it wouldn't solve the structural problem of rising costs and limited ability to pass them on. The system is broken at a level deeper than individual company decisions, and the workers absorbing the impact are the ones you never hear about. Geography makes everything worse. If you live in a city with multiple grocery options, you have choices. If you live in a rural community, you might be watching your last option disappear. Nearly 54 million Americans live in food deserts, areas where access to affordable, nutritious food has effectively collapsed. These aren't abstract zones on a government map. These are real towns where the grocery store closed and nothing replaced it. Research on rural grocery closures found that when a dollar store moves into a rural area, the likelihood of the local grocery store closing is 3 times higher than in urban areas. Dollar stores don't carry fresh produce or meat. They stock processed, shelf-stable items. When they become the only food option in a community, the health consequences are measurable. Obesity rates climb. nutritional deficiencies increase. But the economic impact is just as severe. A town in Illinois lost its last grocery store. Residents now drive 23 miles to buy fresh food. For elderly residents without reliable transportation, that distance might as well be 1,000 miles. They're dependent on neighbors, on infrequent bus services, on delivery options that often don't reach rural addresses. One senior described buying canned vegetables exclusively because she can't make the trip for fresh produce more than once a month. Her diet has deteriorated. Her health is declining. And there's no solution in sight because the economic model that kept a grocery store viable in a small town has disintegrated. The break between urban and rural America isn't just political or cultural. It's logistical. Food distribution networks have consolidated around high-volume routes. Small towns don't generate enough sales to justify the transportation costs. Distributors are abandoning low-profit areas entirely. When a grocery store in a rural area closes, it's often because the distributor stopped servicing the location, not because the store itself was unprofitable. The entire infrastructure that used to make food access universal across America is retreating to urban centers. A community organizer in Kansas described it as a slow retreat. First, the selection narrows. The store stops carrying fresh seafood, then fresh meat, then diverse produce. Then the prices climb because the store is ordering smaller quantities at higher per-unit costs. Then customers who can afford it start driving to the next town. Then the store closes. Then the building sits empty. Then the town's property tax base shrinks. Then the school loses funding. It's a cascade that starts with grocery logistics and ends with community death. And it's happening in hundreds of towns that most Americans will never hear about. The ripple effects extend far beyond food. When grocery prices climb and access shrinks, municipal budgets suffer. Property values decline in areas that lose grocery access. Tax revenues drop. Local governments have less money for infrastructure, schools, emergency services. A town in West Virginia lost its grocery store 5 years ago. Since then, property values have fallen an average of 12%, according to county records. The school district cut its budget twice. The fire department is now volunteer only. The connection between grocery access and community viability isn't obvious until you watch it collapse. But once it starts, the feedback loop accelerates. Families with means leave. The population that remains is older, poorer, less mobile. The economic base erodes. New businesses won't move in because there's no workforce and no customers. The grocery store closing wasn't the only cause, but it was the catalyst that made everything else inevitable. Meanwhile, in urban areas facing different pressures, the impact is just as real but looks different. A grocery closure in a low-income neighborhood in Kansas City created an expanded food desert affecting thousands of residents. Unlike rural areas where the problem is distance, urban food deserts are about proximity without access. The store might be 3 miles away, but without a car, with unreliable public transit, with the demands of multiple jobs and childcare, that 3 miles becomes insurmountable. A worker in that Kansas City neighborhood used to walk 4 blocks to buy groceries. Now she takes 2 buses, a trip that consumes 90 minutes round trip. She can't make that trip more than once a week. She can't buy fresh produce in quantities small enough to carry on the bus, but large enough to last. She's shifted to processed foods that keep longer, cost less per calorie, and are destroying her health. She knows it. She has no alternative. The economic and health consequences of food deserts are well documented. Higher rates of diabetes, heart disease, obesity. But what's less discussed is the time tax. The hours lost to traveling for food. The productivity lost to poor nutrition. The mental load of constantly calculating food logistics. These costs don't appear in inflation statistics. They don't get measured by economists. But they're as real as any price increase, and they're falling hardest on people who were already struggling. A public health researcher described food deserts as a perfect illustration of how poverty compounds. You're poor, so you live in an area with limited services. Limited services mean worse food options. Worse food options mean worse health. Worse health means more medical costs and missed work. Missed work means less income. Less income means you can't move to a better area. The cycle perpetuates itself, and grocery access is one of the key mechanisms driving it. Some communities have tried to solve the problem through intervention. Government subsidies for stores willing to operate in underserved areas. Nonprofit grocery cooperatives. Mobile markets that bring food to neighborhoods. None of these solutions have scaled successfully. The economic fundamentals don't work. A grocery store requires a certain volume of sales to cover its fixed costs. When the local population can't generate that volume, or when the local income levels mean customers can only afford low-margin products, the math doesn't close. A nonprofit in Detroit tried to open a grocery cooperative in a food desert. They raised funding, secured a location, stocked the shelves with affordable produce and staples. Within 18 months, they were facing closure. Residents wanted to shop there, but the prices required to cover costs were higher than the dollar stores nearby, and many households simply couldn't afford the difference. Even when the community wanted to support the cooperative, economic necessity forced them to choose the cheapest option. The cooperative is still operating, but only through constant fundraising and volunteer labor. That's not a sustainable model. It's a stopgap that will fail the moment the grants run out or the volunteers burn out. Meanwhile, some states have tried incentivizing grocery chains to expand into underserved markets through tax credits and subsidies. The results have been mixed at best. A chain might open a store, collect the subsidies, and then quietly close a few years later when the incentive period ends. Or they'll open a smaller format store with limited selection and higher prices, technically fulfilling the agreement, but not actually solving the food access problem. The structural issue remains unsolved. Food distribution in America was built on a model that assumed density, volume, and consistent demand. That model is breaking down under the combined pressure of population shifts, rising costs, and changing consumer behavior. No one has figured out how to make grocery retail economically viable in low-density or low-income areas without ongoing subsidies. And political will for those subsidies is limited and inconsistent. A policy analyst described it as a problem everyone acknowledges, but no one wants to fund. It's expensive, it requires long-term commitment, and the benefits are diffuse and hard to measure in ways that win elections. So the problem persists, and in many areas, it's getting worse. The retreat of grocery infrastructure from struggling communities is one of the most significant economic and social shifts happening in America right now. But it happens store by store, town by town, neighborhood by neighborhood. It never makes national news because there's no single dramatic moment. Just a slow, steady erosion of access that leaves millions of people worse off in ways that are hard to quantify, but impossible to ignore if you're living through it. What does all of this mean for the identity of American life? For generations, part of the unspoken promise was that food would be accessible, not gourmet, not fancy, but available. A working family could go to a store, buy a week's worth of meals, and the cost would be a manageable part of the household budget. That promise is breaking. It hasn't shattered completely, but the cracks are spreading. And once people lose faith in the basic accessibility of food, everything else starts to feel uncertain. The families adjusting their diets, cutting meat, buying fewer fresh vegetables, stretching meals with cheaper fillers, they're not just changing grocery habits. They're fundamentally rethinking what standard of living they can expect. The workers losing hours, patching together part-time shifts, they're not just facing a temporary setback. They're realizing that the job stability they thought was baseline is gone. The communities watching stores close, making longer drives, losing tax revenue. They're not just dealing with an inconvenience. They're watching their towns become unviable in slow motion. This is a restructuring of American life that most people experience as individual struggles. Hardly anyone connects the dots to see it as a system-wide transformation. But that's what it is. The way food moves through this country, the way it's priced, the way it's accessed, all of that is changing in ways that will define the next decade. And most of the changes are making life harder for the people who are already on the edge. There's no villain in this story, no single corporation or policy to blame. It's a convergence of economic forces, logistical realities, and structural vulnerabilities that have been building for years and are now reaching a breaking point. The pandemic accelerated it. Inflation exposed it. But the underlying fragility was always there. The real price of groceries in America isn't just what you pay at the register. It's the hours you lose traveling to find affordable food. It's the health consequences of eating worse because fresh food is out of reach. It's the towns that empty out because basic services disappeared. It's the workers trapped in part-time poverty despite wage increases. It's the families reorganizing everything around what they can no longer take for granted. These patterns aren't abstract. They're not temporary. They're not going to reverse themselves when inflation cools or supply chains stabilize. Something fundamental has shifted, and the people living through it are the only ones who see the whole picture because they're experiencing every piece of it at once. What's changed where you live? What did you used to take for granted that now feels uncertain? Tell us in the comments.